My name is Laura Gardner, and I am a research assistant at the Jean Monnet Network on Transatlantic Trade Politics. This is part of a series of interviews for the network called the Transatlantic Trade Videos. We're here today with Dr. Gerry Alons, who is an Associate Professor of Sustainable Agri-Food Governance at the Political Science Department of Radboud University in the Netherlands. Welcome, Dr. Alons, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
Let's get started with our first question. Your recent research examines standardization in EU trade agreements. What is meant by standardization, and why is it an important dimension in analyzing EU trade policy?
So regulatory standardization involves the setting of regulatory standards, shared standards in trade agreements. And these can be, for example, about environmental protection, consumer health, or food security. And the thing is that when different countries apply different standards in these domains, then it can inhibit trade. So if we take the car industry, for example, it has safety requirements. And if these, for example, were to be different between the EU and the United States, which they are, this means that producers on both sides of the Atlantic need more than one production line to meet the different requirements that the different entities have. And there will be double testing, both conformity testing in the US and the EU before the products can go to the other markets. And this, of course, has economic disadvantages for producers, and it inhibits trade. So the idea in trade agreement is that if we standardize these type of regulations, it will be less costly for producers and will open up markets, which is in the economic interest of both partners. So that's the idea, and regulatory standardization is important for the European Union, obviously for such economic reasons, but the European Union also considers trade agreements as a way to export their ideas and worldviews behind the regulations they have to other parts of the world. And this is particularly the case with respect to agricultural regulations I have investigated.
You analyze standardization in the agricultural chapters of trade agreements and look at two important aspects: geographical indications, or GIs, and food safety regulations. Let's talk about GIs first. What are they, and why is the EU so bent on exporting EU standards in this area?
So geographical indications, or GIs for short, may not be a very familiar concept for many people, but when I mention examples such as Champagne, Roquefort cheese, Parma ham, or from my own country, North Holland Gouda cheese, this probably does ring a bell. And these four names are so-called geographical indications, names that are used for products that come from a particular origin, a region, a geographical origin. And added to this geographical aspect, they possess qualities or reputation based on being derived and produced in that origin. And in the EU, these type of product names are treated as a separate class of intellectual property, and the names are protected in the European market. And this means that the producers of these products who produce them in the region where they should come from, these products, according to the standards that, they should be produced by, these producers have the exclusive and protected right to use the product name in the European market. And so this has economic advantages for those producers. They can get price premiums if a good, very good quality is connected to this product name. These producers are interested in protecting those names. And if you want to know an example, for example, there's the feta cheese from Greece. Before this cheese name was protected in the European Union, producers from other European member states also use the name on their product labeling, and with all kinds of Greek flags and other Greek things in these in their marketing. And after the product became protected, the GI as a name, these other producers were not allowed to do that anymore. So what a Danish producer did, for example, they now have labeled the product with white cheese lumps. So it doesn't sound as good as feta, I guess. I must say that it tastes quite good still, and it's more affordable than feta if you buy it in the supermarket. But these are things that are the result of protecting geographical indications in a certain area. So that's what that means. Why is the European Union so bent on defending these type of product names? Well, if we look at the economic value, we have 5,000 GIs, almost 5,000 GIs in the European Union, and most of them actually have limited economic value because many names are not even known abroad. But of course, there are some very important and well-known ones which are, and the EU is particularly bent on protecting these kind of names. So it's an offensive trade issue for the European Union. They want to convince trading partners that they should protect these product names in their markets as well. So that's like an economic reason. But apart from that, there are also political reasons. It's particularly the southern member states of the European Union, which have a large number of geographical indications for wines and for cheeses, most definitely. And these countries will not accept a trade agreement if no arrangement on these types of GIs are made in that. So the European Commission knows when we negotiate a trade agreement, we have to do something about these GIs. And then finally, apart from these economic and political reasons to want to protect GIs, there's an ideational reason as well, because there's a certain worldview behind GIs that this is not simply a product. It's a very traditional product with perceived high quality and a cultural heritage. And Huismans, a researcher on this topic, used to call it gastro-nationalism. So he says it's a sort of way that in these trade agreements, protecting geographical indications is also protecting national identity and a source of pride. So that's three reasons why I think the European Union really wishes to protect these matters in trade agreements.
Why do some of the EU's trading partners dislike GIs, and which kinds of controversies has this given rise to?
Well, so many trading partners don't use the type of GI protection that the European Union does. What they have often is trademarks, and trademarks are a private property, and it's different than a GI because it's more of a common intellectual property of a whole range of producers. And it would mean that if you have these GIs protected in trade agreements, that it might mean that the trademarks that are currently used on the domestic market of the trading partners cannot be used by domestic producers anymore. So if we look at, for example, Canada and the United States, they work with trademark protection also for origin products, as they call it, instead of GIs. And if they argue that the products name they use, like champagne, Parmesan cheese, etc., that they should be allowed to use those because they call them generic names. So it's simply a type of cheese or a type of wine. And if you produce it in the right way, we should be able to use those labels. Well, these type of producers, of course, lobby their government. And it's in the economic interest of these producers and also of the country in general to be very particular about which GIs you do or do not wish to protect in your market when you make a trade agreement. So these countries tend to think of GIs as protectionist measures rather than deserved protection for quality goods. And in this regard, it's often argued that the US on the one hand and the EU on the other hand have a sort of transatlantic regulatory competition where the EU pushes forward its GIs and wants it to protect it in their trade agreements, whereas the United States tries to put across their trademark focus for these products. And another reason I think I should also mention is that even if Canada, like in CETA, is making an agreement with the European Union, and protecting a number of geographical indications as a result of the agreement, it also means that United States producers of that product cannot label it with that product name in the Canadian market anymore. So it doesn't only have consequences for the country making a trade deal with the European Union, but also for third countries trading with this trading partner. So it has wider effects than only these two countries.
How successful has EU trade policy been in exporting EU standards in this area?
So their success has been a mixed bag, I would say. So one of their objectives have been to reach a higher degree of protection than GIs already have in the World Trade Agreement. So there is a World Trade Agreement, the TRIPS, the Agreement on Intellectual Property Rights, that well, protects geographical indications to some extent. But before you can do anything as a state, it is required that you prove that the use of a name actually misleads the public and that it incurs economic damage for the producers in your country. And that's actually quite a burden to get this proof and actually make your point. So they don't want that type of proof, which is not required in the EU, and they don't want it to be required through trade agreements either. And on top of that, what the TRIPS agreement still allows is correctives. So as I told before, feta can only be used in the European Union if it is actually produced according to the right procedure in Greece. What correctives would allow is that you put on the label feta-like or feta-style cheese. And that's not allowed in the European Union, but in many, like in the countries that only have TRIPS or adhere to TRIPS, it is still allowed. And the European Union also wants to get rid of those correctives in the agreements that they make. So this level of protection that they want, they actually have gained in the agreements that I have looked at. So with Canada, with Japan, and with Mercosur. There are only a couple of caveats. First of all, as I told earlier, the European Union has nearly 5,000 GIs, and less than 10% is actually included in the trade agreements I mentioned. So these agreements have lists of the GIs that they will protect in the future. And in the highest case of Mercosur, that's over 300, but not 400 yet. So that's less than 10%. For all the other product names that are GIs in the EU, no protection is warranted on those third country markets. And a second caveat is that there are usually long lists of exceptions to the rules that are made on the GIs that actually did make the lists. So for example, if some trademarks are already existing in this country, then they are allowed to keep using them or keep using them sometimes indefinitely or for a limited amount of time, say 10 years. And often only new trademarks with that name are fully prevented. And this means that it doesn't completely have the level of protection that the European Union would actually seek. So it has been a mixed bag, their success in negotiations.
Thank you. Your research finds that the EU was able to include fewer GIs in the CETA agreement with Canada than in the trade agreements with Japan and Mercosur. What explains this variation?
Yeah, so the difference is that with Canada, there were 173 names included, 238 with Japan and over 300 with Mercosur. And the explanation I found in my research is based on a combination of economic interests, but also the distance between the existing policy ideas and regulations in one of the negotiating partners with the other negotiating partner. So if there was more regulatory differentiation, it was more difficult to find agreement, and the agreement wasn't as far-reaching as in the other cases. And these variables also affected and interacted with political pressure variables. So you can imagine that if, like in Canada, producers are really detrimentally affected by protection of certain GI names, they mobilize against it. And this makes agreement more difficult and, well, makes for fewer GIs on the list and more exceptions to the GIs that are listed. And if we look, for Canada in CETA, there was a difference not only on the ideological view about how GIs should be protected and whether they should be protected, but the economic interest of the Canadian producers were also very extensive. And that made for, well, the limited number of GIs in this agreement. So Japan is in between. And the explanation here would be that the economic interest of Japanese producers was less pronounced. So they didn't use these well-known European product names as much as they were used in Canada. And on the ideological side, the Japanese government during these negotiations was already in the process of introducing a GI system itself. So that made reaching an agreement more easily reached, and the number of GIs somewhat higher. And then finally, in the case of Mercosur, this was interesting because GIs were also important for many countries of Mercosur themselves, because they had long lists of GIs they wanted to be included there as well. So it was not only the EU demanding this, but they wanted it themselves. So that explains why there is a longer list. But one problem here, or difficulty, was that there's quite a bit of variation in the rules and legislations of the different Mercosur countries. So they don't have one single way of dealing with GIs. And the result of that, or the consequence, was that there were more specifications and exceptions in all kinds of footnotes throughout the list of the agreement, where different Mercosur countries had different types of exceptions to the rules that were laid down. So it's a more complex agreement, but it has more and longer lists of GIs in them that will be protected in the future. Although the agreement still has to be ratified in the European Union.
Let's move to food safety regulations, or more technically, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, often called SPS. How does the EU's approach differ from that of its trading partners in this respect?
Yeah, so SPS regulations, they seek to secure food safety, animal health and plant health. And well-known examples of sensitive issues in terms of SPS regulations are those on genetically modified organisms, GMOs, growth hormone treated beef and chlorinate treated chicken. And the latter refers to chicken meat that has been treated with antimicrobial rinses in order to remove bacteria. And these are all products that actually the European Union is banning from its market based on SPS regulations, because they argue that they're not safe for consumer health. And this is a very sensitive issue because third country parties have undertaken trade disputes in the World Trade Organization against the EU for banning these products from the European market. So it's very sensitive, it's important in trade negotiations. And the difference you asked after, so what's the difference between what the EU view or regulation is here and those of other countries? I think there are particularly differences in world views and also subsequently in the policies that different countries make on this topic. And in essence, regulations on SPS are based on risk assessment. And in the example I mentioned, the question would be, are these foodstuffs actually safe for consumption? And in this risk management, the European Union approach is to not allow products unless they are indisputably proven safe. So this results in more regulation and intervention from the state. And some trading partners, among which the United States, apply approaches which arguably have higher risk tolerance and, for example, give a larger degree of self-regulation to the industry. And the rule then is that products are accepted unless they are scientifically proven harmful. So its reasoning is inverse, or the other way around. And sometimes the EU and US debate in this respect is referred to as the precautionary principle versus science-based risk management. But I think that is a too simplistic a comparison. Because it's not the case that the United States doesn't take precautions or that the EU would not use scientific analysis in their risk assessment. But the important difference is that the EU, their perspective on the basis of their perception of the precautionary principle is that regulations against certain products are warranted if there is an expected risk, also when conclusive scientific evidence for this risk is not found yet. That's, for example, the reason why hormone-treated beef has been banned from the European market for a long time already. The United States has used procedures in the World Trade Organization, to get rid of these rules in the European Union. And actually, the panels in the WTO concluded that the US actually was right here, and that the European Union would either have to stop banning these imports or actually providing scientific evidence that these growth hormone treated beef, the meat from those cows, is actually harmful for human beings. But so far, the European Union has not been able to provide the evidence yet. So this is a very politically sensitive issue, and trading partners are usually quarreling with the EU about it.
Thank you. How has the EU attempted to protect its SPS standards in recent trade agreements, and with what success?
So when we discussed the GIs, I said those were an offensive trade issue for the European Union. They really wanted to export their view on GIs to other parts of the world through trade agreements. And I would argue that the SPS issue is rather a defensive trade issue. It's here that particularly their trading partners of the European Union seek to open EU markets for products they are currently banning based on SPS regulations. So in this respect, it's defensive in the sense that the EU particularly seeks to protect its existing policies and standards in the way of the freedom to regulate, as they would call it, so that they can keep imposing bans and taking emergency measures when they feel necessary, also when they may not have the scientific proof that others would require. And the European Commission usually argues that in trade negotiations, EU food safety regulations are not up for negotiation. And this often does not actually reassure civil society organizations that the European Commission will not give in and will do what they argue is actually have a race to the bottom and lower European standards. So it's a politically sensitive issue in the European Union. And one of the results of that is that the European Commission already argues before they go into these trade negotiations, we will not give up on our food safety requirements. And you also asked about the success in negotiations by the EU. Well, when we look at the freedom to regulate, I would argue that it is upheld in the agreements. So they can have emergency measures, they can block products based on their own rules. But what the agreements often do is prescribe certain procedures by which this should be done. So this could be procedures for conformity assessment, but also deadlines for notification in case of emergency measures against certain products, and a commitment to engage with the trading partner to find a solution that would suit both. And many people have looked into this domain in trade agreements. They argue that the obligations and commitments that the EU makes usually are already met by the existing policies that the EU has. So in that sense, the EU tends to be successful in safeguarding its existing measures. But apart from that, it has not been very successful in exporting its own perspective and its own view on the precautionary principle to other parts of the globe through trade agreements. So that's why this is also a mixed bag.
Thank you. Which factors explain variation with respect to SPS measures? Is what we find, again, driven mainly by economic interests?
So here economic interests play a role particularly for producer and business stakeholders, because they reap the benefits if SPS measures are standardized, because they don't have to need to have different production lines anymore. The conformity testing will be more limited, so it will reduce their cost and increase their profits or decrease prices for consumers. Could end up in different ways. The thing is that their lobby in favor of standardization, particularly in the European Union, is met with fiercer political mobilization of civil society organizations and consumers who rally against discussing food safety standards in trade negotiations. As I mentioned earlier, they argue that it's a race to the bottom. The EU would be giving up its higher standards, and that's not what we should want. And we would be compromising the precautionary principle if we do this in trade negotiations. And this means that the issue is relatively politicized in the European Union. And it was particularly the case once negotiations on TTIP started with the United States. And since the CETA negotiations with Canada was still going on at the time, it meant that both agreements actually got a lot of resistance from civil society organizations with respect to these food safety measures, GMOs, all these kind of things. And there was sort of food scare idea also to consumers, like, we really should not want this. And this led to a lot of politicization and pressure. And this really affected the European Commission. Some research has shown that they also started to use a similar ideational discourse and promised that they would defend the European way of life, for example. So it was not simply an economic measure or a technical measure. It became really a political measure that was directly connected to the European way of life, its identity. And this politicization of the topic, I think, is an important part of the explanation of why the regulation of food safety and standardization in CETA was very limited, and why no agreement could be reached on it in TTIP whatsoever. So we see here that it was a mix of economic, with GIs, we saw that it was a mix of economic and ideational variables that very importantly also affected political incentives. But in the case of the food safety regulations, it's really the ideational aspects of it that caused lots of political mobilization and made reaching a agreement even more difficult. So I think what both cases teach us actually is that it's very important in these trade negotiations on agricultural topics like these to look beyond merely economic interests to explain what's happening, and that ideational variables are very important here as well.
Thank you. Based on your findings, what patterns of standardization would you expect in future EU trade agreements?
Yeah, so on the topics that I have studied and that we're talking about today, I would expect that reaching standardization, both for GIs and food safety regulations, will likely continue to be inhibited by the contrasting worldviews that we have across the globe, and also the political sensitivity of particularly the issue of food safety. Nevertheless, I think on GIs, that if the EU and the US keep trying to export their own ideas on what GIs are and whether and how they should be protected or not, if they succeed in exporting them in their bilateral trade agreements, this might ultimately mean, if we have agreements all over the world, that the result is that there's a sort of global perspective on how GIs and trademarks can coexist. So right now it's really a struggle more or less between these powers with their different views. But the more we get agreements and the more in those agreements we find actually rules on how trademarks and GIs should coexist, it might actually eventually lead to a sort of global level consensus on how we should deal with this.
So that ends our interview for today. And thank you once again, Dr. Alons, for joining us.
Thank you.